never been in a situation quite like this. It's quite ridiculous. In fact, there's lots of patients over here. Come over here, take a quick look. Just as far as your eye can see, there's patients lined up out.
I was asked to do this by the doctors that were there at the hospital. I think it's, they just need another set of hands.
We want to make a dent in this universe in our short time here. There's no better way than figuring out how to live a life of service.
Welcome, everybody. My name is Akshay. I'm one of the interns here at Lenox in the medicine department. We are joined here by Dr. Sanjay Gupta. He's an American neurosurgeon. He's a chief medical correspondent for CNN, also recently elected to the National Academy of Medicine. Dr. Gupta, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, doctor. Appreciate it.
Yeah, and so, the first thing we were all wondering is, are you having time to sleep now?
It's been a really busy few years. I oftentimes use residency as sort of the benchmark of some of the busiest years of your life. Certainly it was that case for me, especially my first couple of years of residency and my last few years of residency in neurosurgery. And I think this has been on par with that for sure. So what I would say is that I prioritize sleep. I think all the sort of gray area in between the activities you do, that's what I've really diminished. I don't do a lot of the other stuff. I'm pretty much, one activity to the next thing, and trying to get enough sleep. But it's been challenging. It's been a sprint, for the last couple of years.
And just for our viewers, are you still operating?
Still operating, yes. Still a huge priority for me. I operate every Monday. I was in the operating room this Monday and seeing patients in the office still, and then we have flow over days. So if there's other days during the week where I have a lot of cases scheduled, I can operate another day as well. So balancing those two things, medicine and media, and finding the inflection point it's something I constantly do. 20 years doing this now. Medicine is always the priority. And luckily I have been working with a group of people now for a long time in both the hospital as well as in the studios and the media side that kind of understand the priorities of how I sort of schedule things. So Monday's pretty sacrosanct, for example, with regard to the OR.
And so we wanted to dive a little bit about your time in residency. I know, you mentioned it's been a while, but as we brought up, you are a practicing neurosurgeon. So where did you go to residency?
I did it at Michigan. I finished in 2000, and it was in many ways the greatest years of my life. I really I say that with no trace of irony whatsoever. I really look back fondly on my residency years, my co-residents, people that I trained with. Neurosurgery is only 2 residents a year. So, but there's 14 residents at any given time, including the interns. And these are some of my best friends to this day. We stay in close touch. And, but that was Michigan, that was Ann Arbor.
And so now, the neurosurgery residency is pretty grueling, as we've heard, but it sounds like your day job today is still pretty involved. So when you compare the two, I mean, did training as a neurosurgeon kind of prepare you to balance all of these things at once?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to give the impression that because something is equally busy in terms of time. I think, the biggest thing, Akshay, is the mental sort of approach to this, meaning that I'm clearly aware that the stakes in one job are much higher than the other. Television is television. I mean, I think it's a very important job, and journalism, I think, serves a very important role. But we're also fully aware that no one will get sick or die if I don't do a television live shot. Whereas being in the hospital taking care of patients, that is they're both busy, but one has a different sort of mental sort of, pull on it versus the other. And medical work, I think, is it's so satisfying and gratifying for that very reason, because the stakes are so high in terms of the work that you do. But yes, I mean, I think that if there was a practical skill that you learned during residency, I certainly learned beyond the obvious, beyond, all the things that you learn about patient management, complication avoidance, all those things. It was just time management and being very efficient with time and learning to triage very quickly. I mean, I think when you straddle two worlds as I do, you sometimes recognize the skill sets that you've learned much more clearly. If you live in those skill sets and you're surrounded by people who have those skill sets, it's sometimes harder to appreciate just how efficient busy medical people are, in terms of time management, in terms of triage. Like, I have to decide, I got two things I got to do at the same time. I did several triage decisions this morning about today, about how my schedule is going to unfold tomorrow, all these things, and constantly sort of setting the table. So it's a triage, it's a time management, and it's an efficiency of communication. Sometimes my wife and kids will say it's a clinical form of communication, which is not the intent. Certainly with my wife and kids, I want to make sure the love and the empathy is there, but it's like, let's get to it. Let's figure this out and make sure we're managing time, being very strategic in how we triage, and doing that all the time.
And so, we talk to our attendings here, and they always bring up, when they reflect on residency, they talk about, there's always one moment that comes to mind, one sort of fond memory they have. Do you have one you'd be willing to share? I think a lot of our residents would love to hear that.
Yeah, I mean, I will say this. I have a lot of fond memories. I will say this, when you look back on residency, and maybe this is a sort of the nature of physicians overall, is that most of the memories were fond. I think the ones that really stick with you were the ones that were hard. Some of the hardest memories. And I remember having this conversation with some of my co-residents just, a few weeks ago. It's the for whatever reason, it's those tough memories that you come to be defined by in some ways. Like, I think you could have 1,000 amazing outcomes of patients, but it's the one that didn't go the way that you expected and was a tough outcome or a tragic outcome even, that's the one that sticks with you. So, whenever people ask about residency, it's a flurry of memories. Most of it is about my friends and my colleagues and people who I stay in touch with and the fun times that we had. But I do think that in neurosurgery, there's a sort of point where it becomes clear, mid-level residency, slightly above mid-level residency, where the staff now has complete faith in you. They have complete faith in you, and you develop a sense of autonomy that is kind of remarkable. I mean, you're still a young adult, and you are in this very privileged profession. Patients have given you their trust and said, basically, in our case, yes, you can operate on me. You can take me to the point of near death to perform this operation and then return me, hopefully, to a life better than the one I had before. It's awesome. It's an awesome responsibility. And I think to your question, I remember I was operating, I think it was a 4th or 5th year resident, I can't remember. And I was taking a junior through an operation. It was a challenging operation. And I specifically noted that the attending, who was around in the vicinity, but specifically was not coming into the room. And it was basically this, okay, this is not a formal graduation, but I have bestowed upon you this honor of autonomy. And that was a really good moment. I mean, residencies, work hard, play hard. So, I definitely had a lot of the play hard moments with my colleagues. And I remember those moments as well, quite fondly. But I think that moment, like, yeah, I got this now. I got it. I've been trained. I've been doing this a long time. I put in 100 hours a week for years, and now I got it. That was a moment I don't think I'll ever forget. And
you touched on these tragic moments that you had. When you had those tragic outcomes, what kind of got you through that? How did you keep going?
Well, it was tough. I mean, I think there were moments where I thought maybe I wasn't cut out for this. That it wasn't so much like some failure as a I just don't know that I'm cut out for this. I'm not sure that it's something that I can do, or I have to go talk to a family and tell them this awful news about their loved one. Just that's hard. I think so I went through that process, and I guess in a strange way that kind of got me through it. And maybe to some degree we have to go through that process. You have to do it. And I really respect my attendings for in some ways letting me dangle a bit out there, because I mean, it's always easy to come to the rescue of your residents. And when I was a young attending myself, now I'm an older attending, I'm one of the older attendings in the department now. But when I was a young attending, you were less willing to let residents operate on their own. You're less willing to have them, again, have that autonomy. But I think ultimately it was my attendings and it was my friends, my co-residents that got me through this. I mean, no one really fully understands what you're going through other than the people who've gone through it themselves. And it's a small group. It's a select group of people. And people who are not in that world will always say the right things, in terms of trying to help you get through it. But it was my friends who helped me, and at times when similar things happened to them, I helped them. So it's a culture, it's a community of people. And I think a lot of times, because medical students are so focused on their academics and stuff, maybe being social is seen as a frivolity, seen as a luxury. And the only thing I would, I guess, say is that when it comes to residency training, it is not a frivolity or a luxury. It's a necessity. You've got to develop that community of friends, even if you're a bit of an introvert like I was, still am maybe. Find that community, lean into that community, serve that community, meaning you're there for them, they're there for you. And I think that's what got me through it.
I think that's really great to hear, and especially the part that, you're still in touch with these people, your co-residents, just because, like you said, I mean, it's such a tight-knit group of people, and people outside of the field don't necessarily know what you're going through. Even though you may tell them and describe it, it's one thing to actually do it. So that was really great to hear. We want to pivot a little bit and give you a chance to plug your new show here. We saw you have a CNN Plus show coming out, where you're going to be taking viewers, kind of engage them with the medical school environment. Do you mind telling us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so it's basically mini medical school, which it was an idea that I've been toying around with for a while, maybe ever since I even started this sort of work. This idea of educating people through different mediums, was something that was always very interesting to me. When at our medical school, one of the most popular things we do for the community is a mini med school. We haven't been able to do it in a couple of years because of COVID, but it was just basically this free open access medical school where anybody could come, and we would do these, appropriate in terms of content, mini med school lectures. And we sort of broke it down by organ system. There's all sorts of different organizational ways to break it down, but that's how we did it. And these are always our most popular extramural teaching activity that we did. You couldn't get a seat in these lectures when we would do this, standing room only. And it just really got me thinking. I think kind of striking to me sometimes that the United States, a country that spends $4 trillion on healthcare, there is a scientific literacy that is lower than it should be. And it's almost like, I think people are very willing to just outsource anything related to medicine and science and their bodies. Like, I'll outsource that. I'm not going to sort of think about that or learn that. You do it for your finances, you do it for your kid's school, you do it for all these other things in your life where you become sort of a mini expert. But with medicine and science, not so much. And I do really think that when you're giving medical messages, if people can also understand why this particular behavior or this medical message from a healthcare person makes a difference, because they can visualize what it's doing in the body. They understand their heart or their lungs or their pancreas, their kidneys, their brain in a way that they didn't before, that it sticks better. It's the how and the why of messaging. So mini med school in some ways is to establish the why. It's the greatest story of us. right? How our own bodies actually work. And actually, I mean, there's so much that you've learned in med school and now in the beginning of your residency, which again, you maybe take for granted in terms of, how these various organ systems work. When you pare down the basics, you explain them in a way that, really makes people take a look at their body and say, goodness, I had no idea that's how things work. I think it really is a very powerful message. So it's called Masters of Medicine. We're going to have some incredible lectures that are going to be very high production values, using, not in a gimmicky way, but I think in a very constructive way, things like augmented reality, using studios. It's going to feel very different than a typical show that you watch on television. And I think the great news is that for the most part, the half-life of this content's pretty long. I don't think much of our learning about the heart and lungs is going to change much. And we may add to it, but it's not like we're going to say, oh yeah, that was all wrong. We're going to replace the show now with something else. So hopefully this will be a show that my kids watch. And I think even more importantly, one day their kids watch. That's the real aspiration.
Yeah, and maybe make their way into some curriculum one day. Who knows?
Yeah, exactly.
But you touched on something. It's something I want to talk to you about, the Fauci effect, as I'm sure you've seen it, being dubbed. Basically, people since COVID kind of taking more interest in their health and in healthcare and in the human body. Have you seen that? If people reached out to you like, hey, I've never considered a career in medicine before or infectious disease, I wanted to learn more about it. Have you seen that yourself?
Yeah, I mean, anecdotally, I have. I mean, a lot of interest in public health. I think a lot of interest in global public health. People wanting to get involved in these fields, and not necessarily a conventional way, working in a bricks and mortar structure within the United States, but increasingly, and maybe it was a trend that was already starting and just got amplified. But this idea of thinking of health as this great diplomatic tool, and being able to be in other countries where there is a greater need sometimes than a well-developed country like the United States. So I think it's been happening. I talk to a lot of college students. I have kids now that are getting close to that age, and it's interesting to see what makes them tick. As much as sometimes people sort of minimize the aspirations of these young people. They're just doing TikTok videos all the time. You find that they live in a more interconnected world, I think, than I did. And perhaps it's because of the availability of seeing all these different corners of the world much more easily, nowadays through social and the internet and everything else that they have access to. So it's just anecdotal. I think that the Fauci effect was in response to an actual set of objective data that med school applications, I think, had gone up. I believe that was what they were attributing some of that to, the Fauci effect, I'm sure, but there's lots of things. Interestingly, saw similar sort of things after previous, big events like, big outbreaks, even pandemics of the past. So it's not surprising, but I think it's very encouraging.
And, one thing we always wonder is you do a lot of media work, you do a lot of, obviously you practice medicine on the side. Ever since you've got into the media, has that kind of made you a better physician, specifically with communication? Yeah.
Well, first of all, I would say, it's interesting. I still think of practicing media on the side versus practicing medicine on the side. It's funny. And maybe that's just it's a sort of conceptual thing in my own brain. But again, with my medical work, it is sacrosanct work, and on paper, it breaks down to sort of a 50-50 split, because that's what you need to write down. You have to write down your schedule and your process for your academic appointments. So it's sort of a 50-50 split, but I still think of medicine as my day job. It's the thing that in terms of time, but also in terms of mental bandwidth, the thing that I think about the most. If I'm operating on Monday, spending a lot of Sunday really planning for these cases, talking to families, reviewing the scans with my residents, all of that. But yeah, I think they have complemented each other in a way that surprised me. I think for a lot of people, when you straddle two fields, and a lot of doctors straddle different things nowadays. Mine happens to be this world of media, but there's doctors who straddle things that on sort of first appearance would appear totally disparate. Like that is a very different thing. But in fact, you find that there's a lot more connective tissue than you realize between the two. I think being a journalist has helped me become a better doctor. And I think part of it is because they're both really human professions. And I think the thing about journalism is that you really want to know every detail of the story of a character that you're profiling, that you're following. And in medicine, you kind of want to know that as well. But sometimes I think the process of medicine becomes reductionist. So instead of the, 67-year-old guy who's a fly fisherman from the Northwest who loves to take his grandkid fly fishing. And one day he was fly fishing and his boots kind of got stuck in the mud and the water was rising. And as a result of trying to extricate himself, he felt a sharp pain that went down from his back, down his left leg into his big toe. It's a very visual sort of image. And the first thing I'm going to ask that guy when I go to see him in the clinic is about his fly fishing. That's very different than saying we got an L5S1 disc in room 4, right? So I think there's a great value to just those extra details of the storytelling, not just because they're fun to hear and they're good to hear, but they're much more likely to stick in your brain. You're much more likely to remember that about the person. And I do think that the learning that comes with that is more profound as well. Like, why would a guy whose boots got stuck in the mud while he was fly fishing and he was trying to extricate himself, why would that lead to a herniated disc? What were the movements on his back? What were the forces, that caused that to happen? I just think that the journalism part of digging for those details of the story is something now that I incorporate into my medical work. And all my residents, when they're presenting to me on rounds and things, they know that I love that and they love it too now. And as a result, I think the type of rounds, the type of communication on the rounds with my residents now are different than when I was a resident myself.
I went to med school with one of your residents, Ilya Rybkin.
Oh, great.
Yeah,
Great.
yeah. So he was very excited to match there, of course. But one thing we did want to talk about too is, you were recently elected to the National Academy of Medicine. It's one of the highest, honors you can get as a physician. And you've emphasized today that your main role is as a physician, and the media is, on the side, at least in your mind. What did that feel like when you got the email that, hey, you were going to be elected to this society?
Honor, surprise, a bit. Since I've started med school, you knew who the academy members were. It was the international, it was the IOM before and National Academy now. So, it's an incredible group of people. So I felt surprised, honored, but also, felt that there was a real opportunity here. I mean, the academy exists, I think, in some ways to continue to progress our knowledge of science and to set that evolutionary path of how we grow as a society down, to create that record and to encourage that science and to nurture it. So to be somebody who could help do that, I feel like in some ways is a combination of both the things that I've been doing in medicine and media. That's what I've always wanted to do. It's a recognition, I think, the National Academy, that we're still learning. I mean, we're still at the early days of our scientific endeavors. I mean, yeah, we've had more scientific progress in the last 100 years than in the several hundred years before that. That's true. But it's still the blink of an eye in terms of where we're going to go. And the National Academy and organizations like that are going to be at the forefront of that, really translating some of those important scientific developments for the lay public, making recommendations in terms of how people should think about these new scientific developments as individuals, as a society. So it's just, it's a great honor.
Yeah, I've had, that's incredible. I know we're running out of time here. I wanted to know, is there any parting message you wanted to give our residents? Anyone who may be struggling right now, who may be going through that tough time you mentioned, or to anyone just looking for some inspiration?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I think, like I said, the tough times are the ones that you end up remembering the most. So don't be surprised by that. If it's something that feels like it's very weighty, very heady on your mind, um, but you will look back on it with a sense of gratitude, I think, because those are some of the greatest learnings that you're going to have as well. So think of those moments that way. Think of those, lean into it. Don't shy away from what has happened, but make sure you don't lose the lessons there as well. Share those lessons as well. The other thing I would say, look, I like a lot of other people straddle two worlds. I straddle the worlds of medicine and media. And for 20 years, I've been doing this. And as I said, Akshay, I still think of medicine as my primary love. Maybe that's the best way to frame it. It's the thing I love the most. It's the thing that I spring out of bed in the morning to go do. I don't always spring out of bed in the morning to go do a live shot for television, but I spring out to go take care of my patients, go to the hospital. And I'm doing this after, a long time now. I've been doing this quarter century. So it's a long time. It's the greatest profession in the world. It really is. And I think maybe I'm uniquely qualified to say that because I straddle two worlds. Sometimes if you're in it and you don't get the context of your life outside of it, you just tend to look at some of the less favorable aspects, things that aren't as favorable or bring you as much joy. But when you get to step outside of it every now and then and look inside, it's the greatest profession in the world. So I know this is Resident Appreciation Day or Resident Appreciation Week, year. It should be all the time. As an attending, I say that, but certainly no matter what, you have my appreciation.
All right. Thank you so much. That was Dr. Sanjay Gupta here for our Lenox Hill Resident Appreciation Day, brought to you by the House Staff Association. Thank you all so much for joining us, and enjoy the rest of your day.